Good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us for a conversation on the soon-to-be published anthology, A Field Guide to White Supremacy, such a timely topic. My name is Tracy Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Before I introduce our guest speakers tonight, I'd like to thank the co-presenters of this book event, the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, and the Department of History at the University of Chicago. And in particular, I'd like to thank Caitlin Cassidy and the rest of the staff at Seminary Co-op who organized the logistics and tech, and Race Center staff members, Tierra Kilpatrick, Beth Awano, and Angel Torres Guevara, who managed publicity for tonight's event. Now on to our speakers. First, we'll hear from Kathleen Belew, who's an assistant professor of US history and the college and a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Race and Culture, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and the Democracy Initiative at the University of Chicago. Her award-winning teaching centers on the broad themes of history of the present, conservatism, race, gender, violence, identity, and the meaning of war. Kathleen's first book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement in Paramilitary America, uses previously classified FBI documents and vivid personal testimonies to explore how white power activists created a vast and influential social movement through a shared post-Vietnam story about betrayal by the government. In addition to her scholarly publications, Kathleen has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN.com, The Daily Beast, and Dissent. And she and her research have been featured in outlets such as Esquire, Time, the Chicago Tribune, MSNBC, and NPR. Kathleen is the co-editor, Ramon Gutiérrez, of A Field Guide to White Supremacy, which features several pieces of her writing, including the chapter, There Are No Lone Wolves, The Power Movement at War. And the book is scheduled to be available to purchase on October 26th. Kathleen will be joined in conversation by Roderick A. Ferguson, who is the William Robertson Coe Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. He is the author of One Dimensional Queer, We Demand the University and Student Protests, The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, and Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique. He's the co-editor with Grace Hong of the anthology Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization. He's also co-editor with Erica Edwards and Jeffrey Ogbar of Keywords of African American Studies, and he was the 2020 recipient of the Kessler Award from the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the City University of New York Graduate Center. For A Field Guide to White Supremacy, Roderick contributed the chapter, Homophobia and American Nationalism, Mass Murder at the Pulse nightclub. The format for tonight will include comments from both authors, and a conversation between them to be followed by a Q&A with the audience. Please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box. The chat is also active. And now I will pass the mic over to Kathleen Belew.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And I just want to extend our thanks to you for organizing and for introducing and handling the Q&A today, and for the Center of Race, Politics, and Culture support of the volume. And if you'll all forgive me, I just want to quickly thank the people that contributed money to the conference that began this anthology and along the way. So the Lawrence Grauman Fund at California Press, the CSRPC, the Franke Institute for the Humanities, International House was so gracious to let us host the conference there, the Global Studies Mobility Project, the Department of History, the Social Sciences Division, and the Chauncey and Marian Deering McCormick Foundation all contributed to this project. And thanks to the Seminary Co-op for hosting us tonight. And before I speak, I just want to also say we are all here without my wonderful co-editor and esteemed colleague, Ramon Gutiérrez, who is ill and could not join us. So if everyone could just send some healing vibes towards him, I would personally appreciate it. And hopefully he will be joining us in some of these conversations about the volume sooner than later. This all started from his impetus in wanting to think about how to bring together conversations about studying anti-immigration and the history of legal exclusion with the study of white supremacy more broadly. And that led us to a conference that brought a lot of these pieces of writing to fruition early in the process. And then we went and commissioned a whole bunch more, including Rod's excellent essay on the Pulse nightclub shooting that had appeared previously. And remind me, where was it, Rod?
I think it was in GLQ.
Yeah.
GLQ.
Thank you. Yes, we were looking for something specifically about that, and we were so delighted to find your piece. So this book came from both Ramon and I feeling that even within the academy, when we study the various sites where we experience white power, white extremism, white supremacy, the history of legal exclusion, the history of systemic racism, the history of individual racist ideology. These are often located in different fields of the academy. There are good reasons for this. But for instance, there aren't that many times when someone who studies the white power movement, as I do, is in conversation with, say, the folks in the law school about the history of racial exclusion, the folks in ethnic studies programs about impacted communities when we're talking about anti-immigrant violence, et cetera. So this began with an academic impetus to bring together these different conversations around what we might learn from each other. Very, very quickly, it turned into a broader conversation because we realized that for journalists, for activist communities, and for general readers, there was a lot of definitional work needed around many of these topics. So this is not unlike the keywords series for kind of a different audience. And I'd love to talk more with you, Rod, about that project. But at some point doing interviews for Bring the War Home, I ended up just picking up the Associated Press style book, which is still sort of the main piece of information that you can find in person at a newsroom when you're thinking about whether to capitalize a word, which terminology ought to be used for what, and sort of a basic manual of operations for journalistic coverage. And I was very startled to find that the 2019 edition had long entries on ISIS, on Al-Qaeda, even on the Irish Republican Army, which has not lately been in our headlines, at least in the United States, and hardly anything on the militant right and the white power movement. What it did have was outdated, mostly about the alt-right and Charlottesville. It didn't have things about the Klan, about militia movements, about skinhead organizing, much less the current day formations like Boogaloo, Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, et cetera. And I found that a lot of what I was doing in interviews was sort of laying out the land for journalists who were almost always new to thinking about these stories, and then trying to connect them with appropriate experts to ask more specialized questions. So the field guide does both of those things. We open with a set of considerations for the AP style book. I would not go so far as to call these recommendations because I have never managed a newsroom, and there's a whole process over there for how they think about language. But there are also things that historians sort of think of as best practices that are informed by our area of study. And this is true for legal scholars and others who consulted with us on that section. So for instance, when there is a new sort of arriving group of immigrants, there are deep historical reasons not to use language like flood or tide or wave, and not to use language like horde or other sorts of animalistic imagery, because these sorts of linguistic decisions have been used to demonize arriving immigrant groups, I mean, at least back to the 1890s, if not for a much longer period of time. So the beginning section of the field guide is really just about language and terms. These are not easy decisions. And one of the ones we really struggled with is as different news outlets have decided to capitalize the word Black, what do we do about capitalizing the word white? We ended up feeling that we ought not to, but I think this is the beginning of a conversation. So there's stuff in there for journalists. And then the field guide is divided into 4 sections, thinking about how white supremacy has worked and does work now. And this might be a good time for me to just lay out how we're using that term in this volume. And I'm working out this metaphor sometimes on Twitter and sometimes with people. So you tell me if it doesn't work. I think what we have here is an idea of white supremacy is like a fence. And there are many different planks in this fence. Sometimes they touch, sometimes they don't. So if my first book about white power violence is one plank in the fence, there are many other planks in this fence, like disparities of medical outcomes based on race, like the law that makes it easier to convict people of color, like incarceration and policing practices, like racial capitalism and accumulation of wealth. We could go on. And for general readers, part of what we're trying to show here is that it's not enough to just not continue to build the fence, because here this fence is, and we, if we would like to have a more democratic society, we have to figure out how to move past it. But it's also not enough to just deal with racial violence, because there's still the whole rest of the fence that we have to think about. And there are people with overtly white supremacist ideology, nativist and national policy making decisions that are reinforcing this fence all the time. So the guidebook is really meant to lay out that entire set of problems. And it does so in an anthology, of course, where these chapters are standing as separate pieces, but that we really think that by seeing the whole of this thing, we might be able to approach this problem, or at least contribute to that conversation. And then finally, I'll just say that the outcome we're hoping for here is that by putting these stories together, we might be able to locate different kinds of coalition building and different kinds of possibilities for action that might otherwise have been invisible. So for instance, going back to white power violence and the organized white supremacist violence that I study, we often consume stories about white power shootings as anti-Latinx violence in El Paso, anti-Black violence in Charleston, anti-Semitic violence in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, anti-Islamic violence in Christchurch. But all of those actions were carried out by gunmen who share an ideological frame, who share a social movement backing up what they're doing, even who use the same images and languages in their manifestos. And when we understand these events as interconnected instead of standing as the work of quote unquote lone wolves, all of a sudden these impacted communities have something in common because they're facing the same problem. And those impacted communities don't have the same levels of public validation, of resources, of media attention, and connecting them might make something possible. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm happy to spend most of our time today in conversation and with your questions, and I will turn it over to Rod. Thank you very much for joining us too. Rod, I really love the piece in this book, and I'm so happy to hear from you about it.
Okay, well, yeah, the piece really came about out of a kind of curiosity that I had in terms of the media and political responses to the 2016 shooting. So just to jog people's memories, Omar Mateen, who was an African-American born and raised within the US, went to the Pulse nightclub and shot and killed 49 people and injured 53 people. Now, the discourse that came out of that, from the then politicians at the time, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, they all framed him, in terms of, one, as if he were not, an American, and as if homophobia was an exceptional thing to the US and could be explained, in terms of his foreign origins, right? That was curious to me because it was a way of forgetting just the everydayness of homophobic violence. One that, and you think here about, this was not the first shooting at a gay nightclub. And oftentimes those shootings, were carried out by American citizens who were white, right? And so that was a real curiosity for me. Like, why make homophobia into this import, from other parts of the world, particularly uh, the Muslim world. So that was one. The other thing that I wanted to do is actually to address the everydayness of violence, within US society, particularly homophobic violence within US society. It doesn't even have to take, a sort of spectacular outcome as a mass murder. It could be bullying in schools, it could be, harassment in the workplace, it could be any number of things, homophobia, transphobia, when we're talking about sports, right? But there's an everydayness, to homophobic violence, and that violence takes many different expressions, right? The other thing I wanted to do is to connect it to precisely what you and Ramon do in the framing of the book, and connect it to white supremacy, right? That the reason that you can turn homophobia into a foreign import is, through a logic that says that, the US is always on the side of right, where queerness, homosexuality, LGBTQ stuff is concerned, and that the Islamic world is constructed then as a monolithically homophobic and patriarchal, site. Now, all of those come out of, whether we call it a kind of Orientalism, and Islamophobia, they're kind of siblings to white supremacy. If you're thinking about white supremacy on a global scale at that point. And so that was the impetus for the piece, to say that there's nothing exceptional about homophobic violence or Islamophobia, in the US, and also that we are in a very dangerous moment globally, where the production of an other, becomes part of national politics, not only in this country, but in other countries, especially ones that are experiencing, like this country, a kind of authoritarian discourse, So yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that and we can start our conversation.
Thank you. I think that also something that stood out to me in your comments is something I've been thinking about a lot in regards to white supremacy and in regards to kind of social phenomena in general. So one question that I get a lot thinking about mass shootings is, if we want to study the problem of gun violence, we shouldn't really study mass shootings, right? They're rare. A small number of people are impacted. If we want to look at the problem of gun violence, surprise, surprise, it corresponds with neighborhoods that were once redlined, with a number of other factors having to do with over-policing and under-resourcing, and availability of guns. But I think that there's something really interesting in the way that you're framing it that really gets at this question of, what can a mass shooting tell us about gun violence as a broader social problem, right? Like, in what ways does an act of mass violence mobilize homophobia, white supremacy? I suppose I'm clutching for what the right word is for the transnational component of what you're talking about. I suppose Islamophobia, but it's also sort of like U.S. imperial.
Yeah, it's also the militarized ethos and attitude that pervades this country.
Yeah.
I mean, you would not have a kind of adoration of a gun, adoration of weapons, even when you're talking about sort of local and domestic setting, if you did not already have a national history that fetishized militarization,
Yeah.
Like, they're actually really connected.
Yes. And of course, the huge event that happened while this book was in production was the insurrection on January 6th, which really brought a lot of these essays into even starker relief for us as we were editing the volume. But I think also having a language for being able to explain. So I think of January 6th as sort of the collision of what we might think of as the Trump base, which has, of course, varying degrees of radicalization and intensity, with QAnon, which is a new sort of mobilization of a very old set of conspiracy theories, with the organized white power movement, which to me is the most predictable and familiar of those three strands, because it's the one that I've studied. It's the one that has a big footprint in infrastructure and history, a big social network that we can look at and trace. But those three things coming together really stretches, I think, the kinds of expertise that historians and academics can claim in some ways, because we're talking now about not only the underground violent revolutionary component of that movement, but also the way that our mainstream politics is making space for and condoning and failing to investigate, and in some cases electing people who are in these groups. BuzzFeed just published something about, I think it was 48 elected officials during the Oath Keepers, which is just stunning and not something that ever would have been possible during the time that I was studying in the 1980s. This is
Say that again, Kathleen. So 48 again.
It was something like 48 elected politicians are members of the Oath Keepers or have strong ties to the Oath Keepers, and in many cases talked about not decrying their affiliations with that group. I mean, so the mainstream inroads part, I think, is part of, it's something that I really didn't consider much in the research for my first book, just because that door was so thoroughly shut, and now it isn't.
It's interesting because, you began talking about all of these folks in different fields studying white supremacy, which used to be this really specialized niche topic, right?
Yeah.
And, and how part of that is because just the sort of outright and public pervasiveness of white supremacy at this moment, that no, scholar who studies U.S. history or U.S. social formations can ignore it, right? Well, the other piece of that is that, we also have to turn our attention to the links between what appear to be a domestic occurrence and the sort of international iteration, of those things, that in the Omar Mateen case, you've got a sort of national discourse about that stuff happens over here, over there, it does not happen here. You've also got, an internationalist and geopolitical discourse about what goes on over there. Islamophobia happens over there, patriarchy happens over there, and so these spheres that we oftentimes think are separate, the national and the international, come together in these really horrific ways. Yeah.
It strikes me something I saw going around on social media when, after the fall of Afghanistan this summer, quote unquote, and after sort of the renewed concerns about women's rights in Afghanistan, somebody was circulating something at the same time about the incredibly restrictive anti-abortion law passed in Texas. And the fact that we don't have those in the same conversation is an interesting artifact of itself. I also wonder about the focus on how we tell the story about the event immediately afterward. I think is a really interesting through line too, because I think part of the most intense sort of set of deep-seated denials, even by people who really want to confront white supremacy and want to confront what happened on January 6th, is that immediate turn to, this is not who we are. And that was repeated so often that I think they did a New York Times Magazine special about stop saying that, mostly from historians and others who study racial formation. But, it's just a stunning claim that that's not who we are, and not just sort of like in thinking about extremist violence, but in thinking about the way that vigilantism and mob violence with the claim of seizing sovereignty has been used over and over again through American history, or maybe even pre-colonial or pre-United States colonial American history to do exactly this. So that's one of the things that we really wanted to try to figure out in the volume, is to bring together those different lenses. And I think the gender section is another interesting place that we found we needed to articulate some of this, because the way that sort of normative ideas of gender and violence against women, violence against LGBT folks, violence against trans folks, and non-gender conforming people has been used particularly to prop up these bigger systems of power, I think is part of the conversation too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what people, both professional academic or, sort of professional scholars and lay people are discovering is what many of us professional and lay folks have been saying for years, that these things are connected.
Yeah.
They're not separate. We want to tell ourselves that, this kind of stuff doesn't happen in this country, or this is not who we are in our ideals of as Americans, that fascism, authoritarianism, something that happens in Germany, Japan, and Italy. It is not something that happens, in the US. And, we're in a moment where people are starting to see the connections, and other folks are writing op-eds now about, I didn't see it then, and I wish I had.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting to watch sort of the things that I know you and I have been teaching for, I guess I'm relatively new to this, but but that folks have been teaching this for such a long time, and now it's sort of reading out into the public moment, which is really interesting to see. And to think about the all of the different ways where, so one question that I get a lot is about I mean, it's rooted in the sort of American exceptionalism that I think many of us still learn in high school about the promise of the nation and the radical idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And I think a lot of the time people get that piece of the history without the part about that those radical promises were not intended for everyone at the beginning, and were really only for white, free, property-owning men. And then over time, through a lot of work and organizing and coalition building and demanding and protesting and a lot of backlash and reactionary violence, we broadly scraped together that category bigger and bigger and bigger over centuries. And it's always really interesting to me, this idea that that the United States is, or I'm trying to think about how exactly to say this. It's like, I think the threatening thing about talking about white supremacy is that it somehow defrays the radical promises that many of us are very attached to. And I think it's actually, of course, the United States is not unique in its legacy of racial violence and racial inequality. Many, many places have struggled with these problems. But I think we are somewhat unique in how little we have had a collective understanding of that shared history, and how much we have sort of subsumed those discussions. And it strikes me that even something like Make America Great Again is a historical argument. Right, like that enlists people. That includes a category of who is America, what is America, when is America, what greatness is, whether it can be restored or not, whether it should be. I mean, that's an argument. That's a historical argument we should have. And I think that history is being mobilized in a lot of places. I might think of the Proud Boys wearing the Pinochet was right shirts, invoking dictatorship in the Southern Cone. Dylan Roof, the Charleston gunman, wearing the Rhodesian flag As I mean, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, didn't even exist in Dylan Roof's lifetime, and he's invoking that history as part of a
racial. Yeah, invoking a colonial history again. There's the international again.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
I mean, it's I lost my train of thought, but I think like part of what, here it is. Part of what you're getting at is, one of the things that's very difficult for people to confront, Americans, right? And something that I only came to in 2016, that this is a deeply undereducated country.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about, forget whether or not you have a degree or not. Everybody's undereducated, right? What people are educated in is, if they have formal degrees, they're educated in their specialty, But this is a deeply undereducated country. The great historian, John Hope Franklin, before he died, African-American historian, said, it's a country that knows myths. It does not know history, right? Yeah. At that moment, you've got an undereducated populace, right? That, cannot make the kind of connections that the volume is insisting, cannot see and cannot abide contradictions when they notice them. It's a deeply, deeply undereducated country, and white supremacy needs that undereducation in order for it to live. It does.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it, so where should that education happen? If we could recommend things, where should that education be repaired? Is that? It should happen
in our schools, but yeah. But like you have like, now mobilization against critical race theory as if it's in K through 12.
Yeah.
As if Patricia Williams is in K through 12, as if Kim Crenshaw is taught in K through 12, as if Richard Delgado is taught in K through 12, Neil Gotanda, all of these are legal scholars, all right? As if what kids are getting from kindergarten to 12th grade is a study in race and jurisprudence. It's absurd.
Yeah.
And yet people are mobilizing around it, So it's a country that's very invested in preserving certain ideologies and keeping people undereducated.
Yeah. I think also, not for nothing, the fact that we don't have civics in many high school classrooms anymore, the fact that people don't understand the basic functioning of the democratic system, even as it's supposed to work, never mind whether it does work, is another component here as well. There was a couple of years ago, the county where I went to high school in Colorado, Jefferson County, Colorado, which is in the suburbs, had a push from a sort of coalition of ultra-right school board members to replace the AP US history curriculum with one that was more patriotic and did not promote civil disobedience, was the package. And an interesting thing happened where all the high schoolers got really mad and walked out. This is a very, very white school district where, Colorado is a purple state, of course, purple leaning blue, and this district has some democratic politics, but it is not a radical place. Like, this is not Boulder or something. Yeah. And these kids, like, it was much more than just the AP US history students. It was a whole bunch of other people who were feeling very protective of their right to learn history. And it was interesting how deeply this issue sort of went all of a sudden. And they ended up organizing to get the school board thrown out and to get other people elected. And it was a really interesting thing to watch. And it makes me think that, like, as work by, Natalia Melman-Petrozella and Elizabeth Gillespie-McCrae and others has shown, these school board battles have been a site of organized sort of white supremacist and ultra-right curriculum planning and local political drives for at least since Reconstruction. But there is, that resistance to it is interesting too. And I was happy to see that, but that was pre-critical race theory kerfuffle. So, we'll see how this shakes out in local school boards as well.
Yeah, I think I think we're going to see resistances like that, from young people, especially because, one of the benefits of social media, though there are ills to it, is that, folks are getting word about, this text, that writer, from venues outside of the classroom. And so oftentimes you'll have students who have been reading outside of the received curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely, which is an interesting one too. And I think I would really love to speak to some people who work in who do media studies and communication studies, because I'm fascinated with how they're finding those texts.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I've had a couple of high school students contact me out of the blue because they read One Dimensional Queer, my last book. It's like, how did you get this book? And and it's not being taught in a class, but
No, but they're going around. Like they go around. I assume that a lot of this is in places that I don't understand at all, like TikTok and other social media, whatever the next thing is after TikTok that I haven't even heard of yet. But I had an amazing moment where my niece, who is in high school, her teacher was talking about my book, and she called me and she was like, "They talked about your book," and I was like, "This is like a new level of something," because I don't know, that's just like out there in the worldness.
Yeah, no, it's true. My 12th grade nephew decided he had an assignment in his progressive school in Georgia everybody had to write about a famous LGBTQ person. His mother sent me a text saying, he decided he's going to write about you.
That's so cool. I love that. Yeah, that's really fun. Well, I think we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm happy to move to those. I think Tracy is going to come in and help us moderate.
I am. I'm going to jump in. This has been really great so far. So we have a bunch of questions. So maybe I'll read a couple, 2 or 3 at a time, and then you all can kind of jump in where you want. So I'm going to start with the very first person who's thanking you all so much for the work, and is asking whether in these recommendations for language, such as those for journalists, is there a discussion of how white supremacy as it is perpetuated in different contexts? We have words like dog whistling, race baiting, which suggests Southern strategy. And then we have white supremacist dogma in mainstream media context, like conservative news, which is contrasted with Westernist movements like Proud Boys, Great Replacement theorists. Like, how do we discuss all these, how do we make sense of it and help people to understand the various strains? And then relatedly, another question, what do you think about the platforming and normalizing of white supremacist leaning voices, messaging in mainstream media and pop culture?
I'm happy to address that.
Yeah, I'm going to yield to you.
Yeah. So one trick in the format of a style guide is that we can't list out every one of the things that you have just mentioned, even though all of those would, happily create a full entry in a style guide about the ways that they are historical terms, the way that they're loaded, the way that they're problematic, right? But what we did try to do is, so I would separate sort of the historically loaded terms from the things that are in current usage. The style book is trying to deal with both of those problems, I think. So one thing that I learned from my archival research is that people have spent an enormous amount of energy over time trying to nail down the specifics of the white power groups. So in the 1980s, there is a ton of journalistic and academic ink spilled over, okay, exactly which slogan goes with the neo-Nazi group, which one with the Klan group, which people are in which group, exactly how big is this faction or that faction, how much is it, where is the stronghold of each of these groups? When on the ground, that's just not how any of this worked, because people had multiple memberships, people moved around between groups shared information and images, slogans moved around between groups, images and tattoos moved around between groups, and they were nationally coordinated. And at the end of the day, the takeaway for me was that we need to do much less of exactly which is which and much more of what is the groundswell. So the style guide recommendations are oriented in that direction. We give a brief listing of some of the groups that are in play right now, but with the huge caveat, which is supported by the work of sociologists like Cynthia Miller-Idris, as well as the Historical Archive, that as soon as these groups are named and watched, they immediately switch their language, they switch their symbols. So we are interested to hear in a flexible definition that can allow for how these groups operate. And I will say too that this is a trend in the folks that work on this. So for instance, the Biden administration's report on, I forget what this was called. Maybe it was called like domestic extremism report. It's the one that just came out from NSA. They similarly have sort of avoided saying like, this is the definition of the thing, because what we need is something flexible and mobile that can track as these groups shift. They shift very, very fast. Cynthia's work, which started in high schools in Germany, she noticed that students who were banned from wearing a t-shirt that so in white power organizing, 88 is code for Heil Hitler. It's just the 8th letter of the alphabet twice. So they banned shirts that said 88 in these high schools. And then the students immediately started wearing shirts that said 14 divided by 2. Same thing, same signification. We have to be flexible enough to track as it evolves. Okay, and then on the other side, the historically loaded things, we did do some suggestions in the AP section that are about problematic terms. So for instance, we I think did an entry for reverse racism, which is a sort of one of these terms that is usually used to take focus away from actual structures of inequality and towards other problematic things. So I think we put in something like use with caution and a little note about how this term is often used to distract from a real analysis of systemic inequality. So we tried to do both of those kinds of recommendations in the guide.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question came in saying, can you say more about how you think about the connection between violent white supremacist movements and everyday white supremacy? And this person is specifically referencing Trumpism going mainstream, but also the white liberals who might be opposed to mixed income housing and think that affirmative action disadvantages their children and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one, right?
Yeah, because I think, we see so much of that, right? Kathleen, you can start.
Well, I was just, this is where I'm trying to go with this fence thing, right? Like, it's not enough to just not build the fence. The fence is there. So we have to do more than just say that I, myself, and my family are not contributing to, like, I'm not nailing boards onto the fence. Doesn't take down the fence. So yeah. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to the 1960s, and I'm thinking particularly of the critiques that folks like Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin made of white liberals, or what used to be called Friends of the Negro. So people who, weren't like the Bull Connors necessarily, but do precisely what, this colleague is indicating in the question, that folks who were very much invested in their racial hierarchy, like I was listening to some radio show yesterday that said that, like, like white middle class Americans like diversity, but they don't like too much of it. So once you get above like a certain percentage, then, the alarms start to fire off. So that's, immediately about managing the racial difference around you so that it doesn't interfere with your own authority, your hegemony or your property values, And they're late. I mean, again, it seems that one of the recurring themes in the field guide is that there are links between explosive violence and also everyday violence. And that's an example of such a link.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn to another question in the chat. And this one is for you, Kathleen. The term lone wolf. Can you say a little bit more about, this person is asking, is there another word that can be used to describe lone wolf shootings that shows their connections behind their motivations?
Yes. So I think in the style guide, we said lone wolf do not use, like, I think full stop to that phrase. I think I've been having really interesting discussions this week with some fantastic grad students about whether there are any individual and apolitical acts of violence, really, once we start analyzing at this level. But I think in terms of the white power movement, we could say individual actor or cell style actor or something of that kind is usually appropriate. But I think that the impetus for journalists is to figure out what the ideological frame of violence is, what the social connections are, and what the aim of the violent action is. There are cases when there isn't a clear one. And for instance, I'm writing about the Columbine shooting right now. I think that is not a case of white power violence in the same way, although certainly there are all kinds of different degrees of white supremacy at play in that story. I think that journalists should just stop using lone wolf as a phrase. I think that would fix almost all of it in one fell swoop, because that requires a different kind of reporting and a different kind of storytelling. Do
we know what the origins, like how did that even become a thing?
So it used to be used for, I'm trying to remember, I had a research assistant go way back with it. It really started getting used for this in the 1980s, in part because white power movement activists were describing themselves this way. So there was one key person called David Lane, whose nickname in the movement was Lone Wolf, which actually referred to his purported sexual frustration. And he was a member of the Order, which was a white terrorist group that assassinated people, stole millions of dollars from armored cars and Bon Marché department stores and Fred Meyers and things like that. And he eventually was imprisoned and wrote the 14 words slogan, which is a catchphrase for white power activists still, having to do with securing the future of the race. So he called himself a lone wolf. He was part of cell style organizing, and that phrase was popularized in part by people in the movement. So if for no other reason, then I personally think it is better when a movement like this that is violent and harming people and waging direct attacks on our country and our just people is interested in disappearing. I would like to shine a light. So, yes.
Thank you for that. We have a couple questions talking about the connection between Christianity and evangelicalism and how that plays into the white power movement. Interested in the role of Christianity in upholding white supremacy in the US, and hear your thoughts about how it's integral to the fence post analogy.
Rod, do you want to talk about the myths part first, and then I'll come back to the extremist groups?
The myths part being, I lost that part.
The myth of the country's founding. This person asked a myth in the country's founding in Christianity and how it was the various definitions and distortions of Christianity, or how Christianity was used to create the mythology of our founding?
Well, I mean, sort of one, an obvious answer has to do with the way in which, Christianity from the very beginning, as it was used by, white settlers, was as a kind of racial and a colonial project, within the country to, one, justify the seizure of indigenous lands and genocide of, Native Americans for being, quote unquote heathens, and then to justify the enslavement of Black people in the country to, to turn them into cheap labor, and also to construct them as, from, savage, dark continent. So, there's never really been a point where Christianity wasn't used for the racial and racist projects of the US state. Now that's to be distinguished, from what, visionaries did with Christianity to align it with liberation and freedom. So we're at a moment, I think, where the sort of use of Christianity for the good of racial hierarchies, for gender hierarchies, for hierarchies around sexuality, the demonization of trans folks, is having a new life.
Yeah, I think building on that, just thinking about what's going on in the far fringe. So now I'm talking not about mainstream evangelicalism in full, but within the white power movement. So evangelical congregations began to grow and become much more politicized in the 70s and 80s, and then really hit in the 90s with the culture wars moment. And I think have been steadily building since then. The white power movement grew at sort of the same shape and across the same years, and in some cases was able to co-opt people out of evangelical congregations and into its fold. One way it did that was through a faith called Christian identity, which is a political theology that claims that only white people are human and everyone else is descended from beasts or from Satan, depending on which doctrine you follow. Christian identity also says that there is no rapture, unlike evangelical congregations. So all of these churches have some kind of belief in the apocalypse at play, the near-term apocalypse, and I will return to that in a second. But Christian identity congregations believed that there would be no sort of peaceful transportation of believers to heaven before this horrible tribulations and the end times battle. They thought their job was to clear the world of enemies, which again is all non-white people, before Christ could return. So the white power movement took that evangelical momentum and the idea of the apocalypse and sort of used it to create this hyper-fueled sense of preparing for race war. So we see Christian identity believers in the 80s and 90s doing a lot of survivalism stuff, learning nuclear medicine, training in field medicine, getting their family ready, all of this sort of thing, and also literally preparing for battle, going to paramilitary camps, amassing arms, trying to get military-grade weapons, etc. I think that, so my study of those groups goes only through 1995. And I don't have a sense of how big Christian identity is in the present day movement, although I still see it referenced with some regularity. But I think that the other component here is the sort of the way that for many people, not just evangelicals and certainly not just white power activists either, but for many people, the idea of the incoming apocalyptic event is very front of mind, in part because of climate change, in part because of the way our culture works, in part because of sort of the political moment. And I think that that drives some radicalization and movement into these groups. So for instance, you see people talking about the nearness of the end times as sort of a reason that they don't need to look after their fellow man, and they instead need to just hang in there, and very soon they'll be transported out. Those sorts of ideologies are very sort of like anti-collectivist in ways that can drive people to political polarization. So I think that those are big amorphous currents that I think are at play in both the kind of broader American culture and in white power activism today.
You know, I think that's great and super helpful. I think it's also important for us to say that you could be secular and still invest in white supremacist ideology.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Like, I mean, if we think about the previous question about the relationship between, white vigilante violence and investments in white supremacist notions around not in my neighborhood, you could imagine, especially the not in my neighborhood person, being secular, and so, yes, Christianity has been a powerful vehicle, or mobilizing Christianity has been a powerful vehicle for white supremacist logics, but it's not the only one. And some of them have been secular.
Absolutely. Another question from the chat. What is the significance, if any, for the government, for the US government, to name white nationalists as a terrorist group?
Yeah. Thank you. I think that, okay, so one of the things to just put on the table is that I think when we think about the government and we think about the state, there are many, many, many levels of activity. There are many different people in groups and agencies in play. This is a complicated thing for the DHS and FBI to name white power and militant right activism, or what they would call DVE, domestic violent extremism, as the most intensive terroristic threat to the country. I am sure that many people who are listening right now, especially my co-presenters, will quickly notice that adding additional surveillance and additional policing has not historically worked out very well for communities of color, even when the attempt is purportedly to target white extremism. So we can look at the long history of FBI involvement in trying to deal with these groups. During the counterintelligence program, we know that although groups on the left and the right were both infiltrated, and the FBI attempted to disrupt both, the overwhelming majority of money, manpower, and violence was directed toward the left, especially towards leftists of color in that period. So what we got coming out of the civil rights movement is a mostly intact Klan, and we never saw anything like the killing of Fred Hampton, or the infiltration of the Black Panthers, or the intensive policing. We never saw any of that against the Klan in the 60s and 70s. Then we have a period in the 80s where these groups were sort of trying to deal with the problem, but frequently it is a game of telephone from field agents on the ground who seem to be pretty aware of the threat, up through the ranks of people who often would not give resources, would not take it seriously. And then there are problems like, what do you do if the local police department is in fact involved with the group you're trying to prosecute? It goes on like this. And because it's a national level movement, these politics are very different depending on where you are. But this is a problem, in North Carolina and in suburban California. It's a problem in rural Idaho and in like suburban Texas. So it's a big sprawling thing. And then we get the Oklahoma City bombing as a moment when the government has decided to prosecute only individuals and not the movement as a whole. So this is like the epitome of the lone wolf kind of moment, right? Where we see a big action that's not prosecuted broadly. And as a result, as a result, people sort of have the idea that the Oklahoma City really was a lone wolf or a few radicals or a few bad apples. And then moving forward, we hit 9/11, where there is a huge direction of resources away from all domestic and DVE activity and towards radical Islamist terrorism and the threats that really came into focus after 9/11. And I think I would be the last person to say that what we need is a Patriot Act for white nationalism or white power activism, because that did not work out very well for us in terms of policing and civil rights and basic standards of humanity. And we know that these policing resources usually cause problems. On the other hand, I do think that communities that are impacted by this violence have not had basic responses from our policing and justice systems. And this is another set of issues coming forward. So all of that is a very, very long way of saying that I think that the resources and attention that come with that designation of these groups really being a terroristic threat have a number of important capacities to move things in the right direction, and not least in the court of public opinion, right? Because there is a reasonable center of people who find that information persuasive in terms of thinking about how to prioritize this problem. But I think grain of caution is very well called for.
Yeah, thank you. So we're at time, but I want to end us on a different note. And I'm going to read this last question from the chat. Who are the writers, thinkers, activists that you turn to for inspiration and motivation for this sort of marriage between social justice and academia?
That's a lovely question. You want to go, Kathleen?
Sure. Mine is Lisa Lowe. I think her formulation of history of the present is amazing. And just the idea that we can have a praxis that is both deeply scholarly and deeply tuned to inequality and social issues in the present has been incredibly eye-opening for me. So she's my one. And Alicia Schmidt Camacho always, who it's a little bit cheating for me to name her because she was on the committee, but I will name her.
That's great. Well, I endorse both of those as friends and colleagues. There's so many people for me. There's one person who I will call out who's deceased, but sometimes people who've been in the long struggle for a long time and also not with us, we still hear their voices. Toni Guevara has this wonderful line that stayed with me for years, and I come back to it now in one of her essays called Language and the Writer. And she says, the task of the cultural worker 10 years shy of the 21st century is how do we save the planet from the psychopaths?
That's perfect. Oh, wow. So I want to thank you two both for a great conversation, all the enlightenment. Thank everybody who came. And we hope everybody will purchase the book when it's available. You can pre-order at Seminary Co-op. And we hope you'll come to some more of our author events sponsored by Seminary Co-op, Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the History Department at UChicago. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.